Okay, hello everyone. Why don't we get started? Those of you that aren't seated, please come in. All right, a pleasure to chair the inaugural the presidential address here, and it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Bina Agarwal. She's currently Director and Professor of Economics at the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi. She's recently accepted an appointment as a chair professor at Manchester University. She'll be starting that position in October. And in preparing these remarks, I knew Bina had made a lot of accomplishments, but I really didn't know exactly how much she had done. She's received numerous honors, including the following: an honorary degree from the University of Antwerp, the Malcolm Adishan Award for Distinguished Contributions to Development Studies, the Ramesh Chandra Award for Outstanding Contributions in Agricultural Economics, the Padma Shri from the President of India, and the Leontiev Award from the Institute of Global Development and the Environment at Tufts University. She shared this award with Daniel Kahneman. The title of the theme of that award was Development and Well-Being in Times of Crisis. So really, that really sort of illustrates, I think, the nature of her work and the relevance of her work. She was also a member of the Stiglitz-Fatoussi Commission on Well-Being, very famous commission by the government of France and President Sarkozy. She's authored 9 books and numerous academic articles. One of her first books was The Field of One's Own, Gender and Land Rights in South Asia, published by Cambridge University Press. That book earned numerous awards and I believe is still in print. Her latest book is Gender and Green Governance, published by Oxford, on the issues of gender in forest governance. She has held distinguished visiting positions at numerous prestigious universities, including Harvard, Princeton, Michigan, Minnesota, and the NYU School of Law. Professor Agarwal's contributions have been both theoretical and empirical, always focusing on the lives of the disadvantaged. And Bina's work, I think, really exemplifies the best in ecological economics. It's theoretically rigorous, empirically grounded, and policy-oriented. Again, that's sort of the founding principles of our society. Her unique contribution has been her path-breaking work, path-breaking scholarship on gender, policy, and well-being, and this will be the talk of her presidential address. The title is Greening Rural Economies, the Imperatives of Choice, Cooperation, and Gender Inclusion.
Since we don't have a lot of time, I'll start straight away. There's a lot of echo in this. Could you reduce the sound a little bit? Yeah. So this is what I'm going to talk about, greening rural economies, the imperatives of choice, cooperation, and gender inclusion. Now, most of us live in cities, as does much of the developed world. So the rural landscape is often just a place we visit for a holiday or even a romantic idyll. But for millions in developing countries, especially in Asia and Africa, the rural economy sustains life and livelihoods. And cities depend critically on villages in multiple ways, for food, migrant labor, raw materials, and energy sources, among other things. So it's not surprising that it is in rural economies and the interdependence between the rural and the urban that we encounter today some of the biggest development challenges we face. Persisting poverty, despite some decline in recent years, food insecurity, depleting natural resources, and the growing shadow of climate change. What we want is a world that is pro-poor, pro-development, and pro-environment. But such a development is a far cry from the standard economist's measure of human well-being, namely GDP per capita. Now, this measure, as many have talked about over the last 2 days and earlier, takes no account of the environmental costs of growth, of deepening inequalities, or the many facets beyond income that impinge on the quality of our lives and our happiness today and will impinge on it tomorrow. Now, these are facets such as nutritious food, good health, political freedoms, and most of all, of course, a clean, green, and sustainable environment. Now, such multidimensional development will need more than green growth, which is typically defined as economic growth built based on sustainable use of natural resources. Green growth alone may or may not lead to green development. Growth is about averages, development is about the human face. Development has a human face. So green development, in my view, would be development that improves the quality of life, not just of the average person, but of the poorest, while also conserving, even enlarging our natural wealth. And such green development, I will argue, will need innovative technical and institutional solutions, which are founded on cooperation at all levels, from the local to the global. And I will illustrate this by focusing on the challenge of greening our rural economies. So cooperation and communities, if you like, will be two major themes in my talk. Now, what would a green economy look like? Among the many facets, 4 would be key: agriculture, forests, water, and energy. Now, agriculture, of course, is the main source of livelihood for millions. Forests are not only carbon sinks and sources of biodiversity, they also provide fodder, green manure, food, and fuel. Water is key to agriculture, domestic needs, and rural industry. And energy, of course, covers the entire spectrum of needs. All 4 dimensions involve technological and institutional choices. And what we choose and how we implement the choices will determine whether green growth and green development will converge or diverge, and whether either will be sustainable. So let me begin with the twin dimensions of agriculture and water. An estimated 2.6 billion people depend on agriculture for a livelihood. And although in most countries, the share of agriculture in employment and GDP is small and it's falling, in Africa and Asia, agriculture still provides livelihoods for almost 60% of people. And this is also where most of the world's population and the world's poor live. Here, the farmers are increasingly small and marginal. Almost 80% cultivate 2 hectares or less. An increasing percentage of small farmers are women, as more men than women move to non-farm jobs. In fact, if you see from this graph, everywhere except in Europe, women are a growing proportion of the labor force. And in Asia and Africa, they constitute 40 to 50% of agricultural workers. So small farmers, especially women, will play an increasingly important role in the agricultural growth and food security of these regions. But small farmers face wide-ranging constraints. Most have minute, unirrigated, and fragmented farms. Many don't own their land, and women are particularly disadvantaged. Less than 20% of women in Asia and Africa own any land. Moreover, there's a growing onslaught on the land of small farmers from corporate agriculture, from biofuel industry, the manufacturing sector, and governments. So for instance, these are just some examples, but there's growing literature on this. Many countries, China, South Korea, India, Saudi Arabia, Sweden, have been securing thousands of hectares for biofuels and crops, or crops. And in 2008-9, for instance, just to look at some figures, China procured 2.8 million for biofuels. You have Sweden seeking to procure 100,000 hectares also for biofuels. So basically, and what you find is the compensation is low and usually goes to men within countries. So what you will get is some countries and people will secure their food security and energy security while others get impoverished. There are also well-documented class and gender biases in access to technical information, credit, extension, storage, and marketing. Few smallholders can move to efficient and skill-intensive agriculture. And this seriously restricts the output, while large farmers overuse groundwater and chemicals with environmentally destructive effects. Now, climate change, of course, will add to these pressures. This is just one calculation by IFPRI. There could be others. But you may quibble about some of the figures here and there, but basically there's consensus that yields of the most important staples are likely to fall in aggregate, and South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa will be the most seriously affected. Now, such developments are both cause for serious concern, but they are an opportunity as well for transformative change. Reducing small farmer constraints could substantially increase production and also improve equity. So, for instance, studies in many African countries demonstrate, these are just some examples, they demonstrate the productivity benefits of gender equity in inputs and access. And according to the FAO's 2011 State of Food and Agriculture report, reducing the constraints that women farmers face could raise their yields by up to 30% and total agricultural output in developing countries from anything ranging from 2.5 to 4%. In other words, we could have both green growth and green development. But how can this potential of smallholder agriculture be realized? It will depend especially on our technological and institutional choices. So if you take technology, for instance, there is substantial agreement that increasing production needs more rural infrastructure, efficient practices, measures to restore soils and water and conserve water. But we can provide infrastructure in different ways. So if we take irrigation, there is a huge potential for raising yields by expanding irrigation. But should we go for large dams? Here's an example. Or for local irrigation systems. Now, large dams have high human and environmental costs, hugely displace people and communities. Community-managed irrigation systems, here's an example from Bali, which I particularly like. These are called water temples, and the water is allocated by priests. Now, traditional systems are not just, they're also demonstrably effective in raising yields. So, for instance, in India, the long-term agricultural rate of growth overall has barely been 3% per year. But in one state of Western India, agriculture has grown at around 10% for over a decade. And a key factor has been groundwater recharge with community-managed rainwater harvesting systems. Now, some systems go back hundreds of years but have dried up with neglect. But there are other examples of new systems being created. So these are johats in Rajasthan.
In northern India, in the state of Rajasthan, the tribal people of Sariska live high in the national park. They used to spend all day, every day, walking 6 kilometers down a steep hill in searing heat to fetch water. But recently, they've transformed their lives by building johats, traditional earthen banks which trap the rainwater. Like an oasis in the desert, this johat is still holding surface water in the heat of mid-May.
So to revive old systems and to create new ones, however, we need community cooperation. And this is the form it is currently taking. So I'll show you another little video clip from another part of the country. Yep.
Innovation was the name of the game. To begin with, several interventions were used to develop the fallow and rocky uplands. As rainwater washed away the thin topsoil, the uplands were left behind dotted with huge boulders. Poor percolation of rainwater in the uplands resulted in poor soil moisture of the entire landscape. To treat these, a unique technique to harvest rainwater called the 30-40 model was adopted. The technique calls for digging small pits across the uplands. The earth that is dug out is used to make bunds that run 40 feet across and 30 feet along the slope. As rainwater falls on this patch, it is checked by the bunds at frequent intervals. Unable to run off, it accumulates in the pits and percolates down, increasing the moisture regime of the entire landscape. As soil erosion was checked, the rejuvenated uplands were ready for cultivation. New livelihood opportunities were introduced for the farmers. As the uplands needed permanent vegetation, they were brought under forestry and horticulture. Elsewhere in the uplands, Farmers like Nepal Baske have benefited from cultivating their homesteads. This was made possible by creating small water harvesting tanks called hapas near their homestead. Nepal earlier grew maize worth a paltry 400 rupees on this land. Now with a new source of irrigation, he is growing tomatoes worth 5,000 rupees. His wife Urmila, who was earlier forced to leave home with him to search for wage labor, now looks after the lemon orchard in the backyard of their home. In the remaining patches, a kind of grass called sabai was planted to regenerate the uplands. Many farmers use it as a raw material for making ropes for domestic use and also sell it commercially.
So this gives you an example of both technological, more innovative technological solutions as well as the institutional basis for that. But now I want to talk much more about institutions and innovations in the social organization of production. So far, farm enterprises are dominated by three models: family farms, state-run collective farms, and emerging corporate farms. Small family farms, as I'd already said, have faced severe resource constraints. Market mechanisms often fail. State collective farms have been long judged a failure, and we know that they led to decollectivization. And efficient corporate agriculture has so far found mainly in land-abundant regions, especially in Latin America, but it would displace the smallholder. So do we have an alternative? An answer could lie in a fourth model based on cooperation between small peasants. And such cooperation could be at many levels. For instance, at a minimum, it could simply involve pooling funds for joint investment in irrigation or marketing. But to overcome land, labor, and skill constraints, we need higher tiers of cooperation. And gains in output and social empowerment would be especially high if small farmers also pooled their land to form what I have termed in my recent writings as agricultural production collectivities. Now, potentially, such collectivities could make the cultivated plots much more viable. They could enable land and labor, land and skill sharing, and most importantly, they could generate economies of scale and new market opportunities. As a group, small farmers could move to higher value, more risky crops with higher payoffs, and it would empower them to actually increase their clout with governments and markets and enable them to better adapt and mitigate climate change. Now, this form of collectivity is actually a far cry from the vast corporate farms or the socialist collectives which were made coercively, which were huge in scale and had high costs of human welfare. What I am talking about are collectivities formed based on 6 principles. Voluntariness, that's very important. Small but viable size, enough to reap scale economies without undermining collective action. Socioeconomic homogeneity among members to the extent possible, participatory decision-making, checks to contain free riding, and a fair distribution of benefits. Now, can the potential gains from such cooperation be realized in practice? I believe so. There are ground examples from Asia and Latin America which suggest that they can be. Cooperatives for marketing and for dairy products, of course, abound globally. Here's an example, one of the most successful. In India, Amul has 2.5 million, mostly poor animal owners who sell their milk through cooperatives. But most importantly, we also have examples of group farming from several transition economies and from India, where farmers have voluntarily pooled their land, labor, and skills. Now, in the transition economies of Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, decollectivization in the 1980s and 1990s gave farmers a choice to revert to individual family farming. But many farm families chose to create new group enterprises on the restituted land, and basically to overcome input constraints. But some of them also say they really enjoy working together. So here is a cooperative like that in Romania. Research shows that these cooperatives have led to higher crop yields and have increased productivity much more than is found on individual family farms. And they have the potential to move to low chemical green agriculture. And the numbers, by the way, are not trivial. In the late 1990s, they covered 43% of farm area in Romania, 64% of farms in Kyrgyzstan, 22% in East Germany. Similarly, in South India, more than 35,000 women's groups are cultivating jointly, some supported by NGOs, others by local government. And here's one example. They lease land in groups and pool their own plots, they preserve their own seeds, and they practice organic farming and multiple cropping to reduce the risk of crop failure and provide a more balanced diet. By the way, if you remember the picture of women farmers I showed you earlier, they were all bent double. And here, as you can see, they're standing upright. And here's an example of a woman preserving dozens of seeds. And perhaps, many of them market their products. And it's possible that perhaps one day this woman's seeds will be preserved in the Norway seed vault, although we don't know what the access to that is beyond governments. Now, what we also see happening is a focus on low chemical, high skill farming. And according to the recent UNEP report towards green economy, green farming practices can raise small farmer yields in Africa between 54 to 179%. Now, these are their figures. But the report says rather little about institutions. And as I've argued, agricultural livelihoods need to be based both on innovative technology and innovative institutions, such as institutions built on farmer cooperation in production, in soil conservation, and in water conservation. Now, these would achieve both green agricultural growth and green development. And it would increase output as well as benefit small farmers, especially women. In contrast, an agricultural strategy which leaves each farmer to fend for herself is unlikely to be conducive either to green growth or to green development. Now consider forests. Forests, of course, are sources of biodiversity, they're carbon sinks, but for millions of people, they're also critical sources of fuel, fodder, and gathered food. And forests and village commons, by some estimates, contribute 25 to 30% of rural incomes in parts of India. And they provide firewood for cooking for over 70% households in South Asia. Biodiverse forests also provide nutrient supplements. And there was a Bangladeshi study which found that uncultivated greens gathered by women provided on average 65% of the food weight of poor landless households and 34% of the food weight of land-owning households. And gathered foods are similarly important in Africa and Latin America. Sorry, this slide I should have had earlier, just slipped past. These are examples of high on skills, low on chemicals. But here's the gathered food slide I wanted to show you. So, a TEEB report estimates that non-marketed natural goods and ecosystem services account for 47 to 89% of what they call GDP of the poor. Now, given their dependence on forests, rural communities have a major interest in improving forest condition. But their dependence can also lead to degradation in the absence of appropriate institutions. So as with water, so with forests, we have choices. For instance, forests can be under state control, they can be under community control, or a mix of the two. State control is exclusionary, community control can be inclusionary. Till the 1980s, forests were largely state-controlled in most developing countries. But satellite pictures, as we know, showed rapid deforestation, indicating widespread state failure in forest conservation. In contrast, ground experience revealed many examples of successful community movements to protect forests, such as the Chipko movement in India, movements for indigenous people in the Amazon, including the famous one catalyzed by Chico Mendes. Now, this difference between state and community control led to a rethinking in both economic theory and policy. Collective action theory became less skeptical about people's ability to cooperate and recognized that things like trust and reciprocity and social norms can motivate cooperation. And policy shifts in the 1990s led 50 countries to move to some form of community forest management. In India, in 2001, there were some 84,000 community forestry groups involving 8.4 million households and about more than a fifth of the forest land. And between 1991 and 2001, India's forest cover, which was declining rapidly, increased by 3.6 million hectares. And this is the image of one village in which I did fieldwork among other villages, 5 years after protection. So as Elinor Ostrom has so eloquently argued in her work, user involvement is essential for building enduring institutions for governing the commons. In my recent research, I take this argument further by examining what impact women's participation in forest government has. And based on primary data for 135 community forestry groups in India and Nepal, I empirically examined the effect of including women in the executive committees of these groups, and these are the main decision-making bodies. And what I found was that groups with a high proportion of women in their ISEEs had substantially better forest conservation outcomes than groups with few or no women. So for instance, in Nepal, all women groups showed a 51% greater probability of forest improvement than groups with men after controlling for other factors. I haven't put in my regressions, but there are a lot of regressions behind this. In India, among mixed groups, women's impact was especially high, where they had a critical mass of 25 to 33% members. And where many of these women were landless, it further improved outcomes. For instance, in one district, which had a high percent of landless women on the executive committee, the probability of forest canopy being thicker was 75% greater, and the overall improvement was 57% higher than in other groups. Basically, including women, especially landless women, what it does is it substantially improves protection and it enhances the ecological knowledge base of the groups. So in protection, for instance, women are found more likely to comply with the rules if they are party to making them. And as some of the EC women said, we now feel the forest is ours. So they used to steal from the forest earlier, but once coming on the EC, they stopped stealing and began protecting. And here's a women's patrol group. They, again, as you can see, they proactively take on patrolling. Secondly, men and women use different parts of the ecosystem. So they have different knowledge about forest species. So women's inclusion increases the ecological knowledge base of what, and forest committees can improve outcomes. Now, my results also demonstrate that although REDD+ is an important global initiative to reduce emissions for deforestation and forest degradation, I believe it relies too heavily on monetary incentives. Whereas what we need is much more institutions that promote participation and cooperation, especially among women and the poor. And this would also link global and local goals. We also, of course, need scaling up, undoubtedly. And so here is an example of how we might scale from the very local to the national. And not just but not in size. What you're seeing here is an answer in strategic alliances. So for instance, in India, you have 2.5 and plus million self-help groups. And they're all village-based. They have a deep interest in local resources. And so linking them to community forestry institutions and executive committees would be a mechanism of enlarging women's presence, and the federations that exist of self-help groups, if replicated on forestry groups, would be a mechanism of scaling up. Now, Nepal has a very important example of a countrywide forest user federation. 14,000 community forestry groups across the country are members, and the constitution mandates that 50% of the office bearers would be women. So basically, therefore, as with agriculture, so with forests, institutional choices based on community cooperation and inclusion of poor households and women can promote both green growth and green development. Top-down approaches can cost us both. And finally, the fourth element. Let us consider the fourth element, which is energy for a green rural economy. Again, we have choices, and I just want to focus on a couple of things. One is rural electrification, and the other is cooking energy. Now, globally, about 21% of electricity comes from hydropower. Namely, it is the most important renewable energy source for electricity production. But much of the potential remains unexploited. In Asia and Africa, by some estimates, only 13% and 5% of hydropower potential is used, although China uses much more, about 25%. Now, although most hydropower is generated through large hydroelectric dams, These cause huge population displacements and environmental degradation, and also forest loss. Also, they cannot reach remote areas. So small hydro projects, including those managed by communities, offer a real alternative, especially for remote areas, thus ensuring inclusiveness. But so far, small hydro projects contribute only 1 to 2% of world electric power. Now, China is one of the biggest producers of hydropower today, but its policies remain mixed. So on the one hand, you see the Three Gorges Dam, which is huge, and it's planning dams in transnational rivers in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, it's also the biggest investor of small hydro plants, especially for remote areas. And so, for instance, the last figures I saw, it had 43,000 small hydroelectric projects with a capacity of more than 35,000 megawatts, benefiting 300 million people in the mountain areas. In India, we again see this duality. On the one hand, we are talking about large hydro projects and dams. On the other hand, we are talking about small hydro projects. But what mix emerges will determine whether this renewable energy simply leads to green growth or also leads to green development. For the latter, it is essential that we weld technological and institutional innovations which are people-friendly. And then very quickly, the cooking energy example. Now, 80 to 90% of households in Africa and Asia, and about 50% in Latin America, use unprocessed biofuels, firewood, charcoal, cow dung, cattle dung for cooking. Now, these are highly environmentally polluting in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, hugely health damaging for women and children who are exposed to smoke in the kitchens. A shift to clean cooking energy and clean fuels such as biogas here would be key ingredients to a green rural economy. For success, however, these technologies need adaptation to user needs and a coordination across different government departments. So again, very interesting examples between India and China. China has several million improved stoves and over 15 million family biogas plants. I have old figures of 2004, and this probably increased hugely since then. And one of the things which struck me when I was looking at the China example was the ability to coordinate across government ministries and between government and communities. In other countries, decentralized local government and civil society could be partners to such efforts. So for instance, as I mentioned, federations of self-help groups in India, Nepal's Forest Federation could all serve as partners in our efforts to green the rural economy. And before I finish, I just want to give you, here is an image of a green, what I hope would also be part of this. This is a woman carrying several kilos of fodder, at least 20 kilos. Now she has access to some technology, so yes, saving energy. So let me conclude. Green growth is important, but cannot automatically bring green development and enhance people's welfare. It could even undermine welfare. In contrast, green development, which is pro-poor and pro-women, can also enhance green growth. So this does represent a win-win situation. Potentially, we could increase GDP as well as equity and environmental sustainability. But to realize this potential, we will need to make choices in favor of innovative technologies and transformative institutions, which include the most disadvantaged. So we can have global treaties on climate change, as we've been working on, including Rio 1992, Rio today. And these are important for conserving our resources, but they're not enough. We also need cooperation among communities which have a major stake in these resources. And in these endeavors, the poor, and especially women, must be seen not just as the main victims of the environmental crisis, but also as central parts of the solution. Now, I've illustrated this by focusing on the vast untapped potential of group approaches to agricultural production, water conservation, forest governance, and renewable energy promotion as 4 critical areas for greening rural economies. I'm sure you could extend this to this argument to other arenas. Basically, I believe it is time to build new associations and strategic connections that would fulfill both local and global goals. And of course, this is the wisdom that many environmental movements and also the vision of many environmental movements, including the 1970s Chipko movement, had in India against commercial logging in the Himalayas. So just to end on a small poetic note, here is one of the folk songs that was used by the movement. And the last para, come plant new trees, new forests, decorate the earth. Let us relieve the earth of the crisis. But I think this is the key phrase, come all join together. Question is, are we ready to do so? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jim Kahn. I'm with the Washington and Lee University in the United States and the Federal University of Amazonas here in Brazil. I really enjoyed your talk and agreed with almost everything you said except one thing, and that is your advocacy of small-scale hydropower as green energy. Hydropower may be low in greenhouse gas emissions. It may not, depending on how the land cover is dealt with before the dams are made. But all dams block the flow of sediments. And sediments are essential to the productivity of ecosystems and agricultural systems downstream. With the rapid rise in very fast movement of technology and solar energy, particularly cheap solar films, which are affordable at the community level, I would think it would be better if we stopped talking about hydropower as green energy, because it's really not, and focus more on small-scale photovoltaics and small-scale wind power as a solution for villages, particularly in remote regions where they don't have to be connected to a distribution network. Thanks.
I accept the comment. I think the point I was making is that we need to think of a mix of technologies. Solar power, for instance, in cooking, people have been advocating solar energy. But if you actually look at the reality of very poor households, solar energy is way too expensive. It's not an answer. And therefore, we need to look at things like biofuels, biogas, which is sustainable, which is under the control of communities and households. And similarly for hydro, it seems to me that wind, there is wind, but what is the percentage of households what is the percentage of total energy which comes from wind? So none of those options need to be ruled out. But I would say that we also need to see how much access the poor have as a result of particular technological choices, apart from what environmental impact they have. Both those need to come in. But thanks for the comment.
My question is about the green development that you talk about. I was thinking what you are meaning with the inclusion of the women in the green development. Because many of the supposedly exclusion of the women in rural communities, indigenous communities, are culturally related. So if we try green development, we also will have to try to deal with this cultural aspect. And I think it's an important factor to consider also if we are talking about this green development.
I didn't quite catch the question. Sorry.
Yes, but you put a special emphasis in this inclusion.
Oh, in agriculture.
Women.
In agriculture. Yes. Well, basically what I'm saying is this is the empirical reality. What you're seeing is that more men than women have moved out of agriculture. Now, that could be because of a range of things, including the nature of skills, the inequality in education levels and skill development, so that men are able, and also social norms. So men are more able to move out, either to non-agricultural jobs within the village or to non-agricultural jobs in the cities. Women are less able to move out. And so you're seeing a feminization of agriculture. But the institutional mechanisms that have been set up for extension, for access to credit, for access to inputs, and even skill transfers are still very male biased. And as a result of that, what you're seeing is much lower potential in agricultural yields and output than you would have if you actually had more equal access. So that's really the point.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yes, I was just curious with your results that showed that women in agriculture tend to be more productive on the same land. Do you think that is because they tend to work longer and harder because they have fewer economic opportunities outside of agriculture and therefore dedicate more time? I'm just curious or do you think it's because of better knowledge base, or what are your conclusions about that?
Yeah, I don't have control over my own slides. No, there are a large number of studies which have been done, especially in the African context, where you can compare farms where women are primarily in control, and you can compare farms where they provide inputs into the husband's land, for instance. And what you find is a mixed set of results. These are not studies that I have done, but I have collated. What you find is that in some instances, basically, if you control for inputs, then you find that women are just as efficient as men. In other instances, you find that they produce less because, and probing that, because they have less access to fertilizers, or they have less access to family labor, and so on. So the argument is, and also that men are often overusing fertilizers. So if you transfer, it depends on where they are in the productivity curve. So if you transfer fertilizers from men's plots to women's plots, this is some of Chris Udry's work a while ago, which showed that then you would actually increase output by 10 to 20%, simply by making it more equitable in terms of access. So that's the range of, the studies show that. Yeah.
I've been puzzled by a new set of findings emerging from experimental and behavioral economics that have to do with gender, and those are that except for risk aversion, there is no pattern of gender differences in terms of behavior from all this literature. Basically, you find studies all over the place with findings in favor or against women being either more cooperative or being more altruistic. I'm talking about the evidence from experiments in the field and in the lab. But there's this exception about risk aversion. That's one of the strongest findings that are from the lab and from field experiments, systematically finding that women are more risk averse than men. And we know this is good for some reasons, and it might be for other reasons in detriment of certain values. And particularly for what you were saying, it kept motivating me wondering what you think, if this is definitely a pattern, and it seems to be in rural areas, urban areas, older women, even younger women, even with children, very early ages. Girls begin to show more risk aversion than men. What the implications are for what you were saying, and I was thinking at least the following. Regarding collective action, we need the relationship between risk aversion and trust. Usually trust is seen as a risky enterprise, and I am puzzled by what you would think of that.
Crops, did you say?
Trusting other person. Sometimes this is seen as a risky enterprise to trust a stranger. And the other finding might have to do with entrepreneurship. You need to be more risk tolerant to engage in new businesses and new ideas. And this has to do with the uses of factors of production. So now you are showing us a lot of evidence of women engaging in risky enterprises of using new seeds, new technologies, new activities that systematically have been decided by men. And now how does that play a role in your studies? And the last one, monitoring and control. Monitoring and control of rules within forests are going to require asymmetric information and probabilities of cutting or not other people violating rules. And again, there's a difference between men and women. So again, risk and gender and collective action are all here related, and I am puzzled of what you would think of that.
No, let me, there are many things that you've said. My understanding of the literature on, which is, there are a lot of summary, very good articles in the journal Negotiation, which the Kennedy School brings out. And in that, the summaries, and they're not field, unlike your work, which lab and field, and classroom and the field, most of these are in classrooms, do show that there are differences in how men and women behave in terms of the gender composition of groups. Now, there aren't a huge number of studies, but there are studies which suggest that women in predominantly women groups tend to cooperate better. Men in predominantly women groups also cooperate more because, Jane Sell's work, for instance, because they feel that they are more able to influence the outcomes than if men were in predominantly men's groups. So I think, the evidence does need to build up, and evidence from the field is very important. None of my arguments are actually about whether they cooperate more or not. So there is an additional dimension of looking at that. Whether they take up more risk, my argument on group farming is an argument, the actual groups that I show are not necessarily at this point already moving into new crops and more risk-prone crops and higher value crops. What I'm saying is that as a group, they have much greater possibility of doing that because they can negotiate markets and they can and spread the risk much more than they would be able to do if they're individual farmers. And given that most of them are cultivating, 70% are less than 1 hectare in size. Some are really minute plots. So it's that sort of argument. And I'm actually at the moment doing some research to see what the productivity differences are in the Indian context in the groups I talked about. The other set of findings in which I've already done research, which is based on my recent book, Gender in Green Governance, has to do with groups with a larger proportion of women and the impact of that on forest conservation outcomes. And there it's really quite amazing. I didn't expect to find these results because, if you control for a large number of factors, you don't know what your results are going to be. So I was quite surprised at how significant it was that you found such substantial improvement in outcomes in groups which had a larger proportion of women. And I also compared all women's groups with other groups. And in that, what was also very interesting is that all women's groups started out with twice as degraded, half the size, and poor quality forests and less biodiverse forests. And they still ended up with much better outcomes. So I think those results are what I probed. And I did find that older women, age does make a difference. So a larger proportion of older women bring about additional benefits, as do landless women.
Question. Do you have an idea of how much these imperatives contribute to happiness?
Well, the groups, some of the groups, when the Central Asian groups did say they enjoyed working together. And if you talk to, just qualitatively, if you talk to the women's groups that I've talked to, then I'll give you an example of Kerala, which I have traveled and I'm doing more substantial research on. And, Kerala is a state with very high levels of female literacy. So, it's like 98% of the women are literate, and many of them have high school, they've completed high school, some are college educated, and they weren't working in the fields. And then when I went around and I found they were working in groups and they were doing manual labor. So I said, well, how come you're so educated and you're willing to do this? They say, well, we just enjoy being with other women and participating in productive work along with the others. Whereas at an individual level, they just didn't feel as motivated. So I would imagine that it does contribute. It's agreeing with me. But all the work that Robert Putnam and others have done is that friendships add to human happiness. So.